And thank you to the St. Francis Peace Center for inviting me to this. I think it's a very, very important conversation. And thank you to all the participants for being here. And I hope these conversations will lead to something more enduring and lasting from here. So with that, I will just screen share my presentation today. Okay, so putting South Asian militarism into context. And I thought that it was important to do this because in the present context, we tend to miss the connections between countries, regions, and the specificities of the histories. And there is a historian who said, you know, those who forget their histories are condemned to relive them. And I think there are some things, at least in our histories, that we would rather not relive. So I want to also bring some of the historical perspectives into this. So that's where putting South Asian militarism into context comes from. Where is the... Okay. First, I want to begin with this whole statement on the coming war on China, which is, I think, now on everybody's minds, but also because I think it has become an important question that comes up again and again when we talk to people anywhere. And the first thing they can say is, oh, but China is taking over the world, or China is taking over our land, or so on. And I think it's important to understand how we assess this conversation and where that is taking us. So I think that one of the most important contexts for talking about militarism in South Asia in the present is the coming war on China and the US encirclement of China policy. Many of you may have seen John Pilger's film that focuses, or that is about this problem of coming war on. In fact, the title, The Coming War on China, is from his film. And Pilger's film focuses on Pacific military bases and the nuclear buildup in those bases. So the focus is clearly more specifically on the Pacific. But what I want to focus on today is South Asia, because South Asia will end up being inevitably the theater for that war, the geographical theater for that war, not least because South Asia borders China geographically. But also because I think this, and sometimes there is a tendency for people to see phrases like the coming war on China as a sort of bogeyman, or as creating a fear psychosis or exaggeration or things like that. But when we look at it, the Pentagon Papers, which was leaked in 1969, says quite explicitly that the containment of China was the rationale for the Vietnam War. So it has been building up since then. And so it's not something that we can take very lightly. Now, there are three fronts to the encirclement of China, or to the coming war on China. One is the Japan-Korea front. And these three fronts are listed in the policies, Pentagon policies, that I will come to in a bit. So one front is the Japan-Korea front, and that plays out in a very different way. The other is the Southeast Asia front, which again has its own specificities and the whole way in which militarism there works. And the third is the South Asia front, which is quite distinct. So although the overall strategy and policy may be the same, but the specificities of each region and their place and in the whole conflict and how it is being positioned is quite different. And I think it's important to understand both the general context as well as the specific differences. The other thing about the coming war on China I want to emphasize is, in a way, it's the unfinished business of the world wars. Yeah, because the US backed Kuomintang and in World War II and thought that after 1945, they will back him and they can recapture China, and and therefore they will have that kind of dominance. And that followed the example of the White Armies after Bolshevik Revolution, because the White Armies captured almost all of the Soviet Union, big chunks of territory. And the White Army thought that they would, recapture it and get it back. But the Bolshevik Revolution did something else. And something similar happened with China. Nobody thought that the Communist Party would continue the fight until 1949. And then, of course, China remained limbo in the Security Council, because that is how the seat was vacant. So there's a whole geopolitics around it. Then the rapprochement started in the 70s and so on. So that has been an unfinished business. So that is why I think we need to take it more seriously. But I just want to recap on South Asian states. The South Asian states that we see today, they were forged in the crucible of world wars, of the two world wars. That was the formative period. This map that you see today of South Asia was a map that was born from the world wars. Yeah. Now, 6 of the 8 states in South Asia share a direct border with China. So you have there Nepal, India, Pakistan, then you have Bhutan, you have Afghanistan there, you have, so that whole stretch is a border along China. So, and then 3 of the states are located in the Indian Ocean region, which is again an extremely important region. There is Sri Lanka, and there is Maldives, and of course, India. And historically, and of course, India dominates. India dominates both the land border in size, in population, and in strategic location. India dominates the region. Now, these South Asian states, one of the notable features of these states is that their borders were all structured by inter-imperialist rivalries historically. Yeah, so the Dutch, French rivalries, the Dutch-English rivalries, the Portuguese-English rivalries. So it is the European powers and their rivalries that decided where these borders fell and at what time they fell. And this history is important because eventually all of South Asia comes under British imperialism and British colonialism. So in that sense, that colonial history is a shared history for the entire region. And that is quite different from many of the other regions. So if you see before World War II, this map on the left side was how South Asia looked. Yeah, so that was the British Empire under South Asia. And you will see there that the mapping of the region is very different from what you see on the right side. Yeah. I'll just go to the next one. If you look at all the yellow regions there, they were what was called the princely states or Indian states. And these Indian states, there were two kinds of rule in South Asia. One was called direct rule, where British directly administered the country. And the other was called indirect rule. So if you look at the yellow regions there, they were all indirectly ruled states. And the pink ones were directly ruled states. And the white one there, Afghanistan and Sri Lanka, and you can't see, they were basically independent, but they were part of the British Empire, but they had an autonomous direct rule status compared to this mass here. So that is the history. And why that history is important is because the modern states that come out of the world wars are forged, as I said, out of that. And there is a whole reorganization and realignment of the political structures that happens as a result. For example, in 1937, Myanmar becomes independent. That's the first province to gain independence. But Myanmar has a very different trajectory because it's the Indo-Burmese wars that actually brought about that independence. Then the Japanese moved into that region in a very, and occupied Rangoon fell to the Japanese. And between 1937, so first the freedom struggle backed the Japanese, they thinking that they would give them, support them against the British. The Japanese did not support their freedom struggle. They switched back to the British. The British never trusted them. Eventually, Aung San was murdered by one of Winston Churchill's close allies. So there's a whole history there on how some of the present day Burma problems directly goes back to, then of course they tried to support his daughter, etc. In India, of course, the unification of India was the big step. And many people forget that India's unification, that is all these yellow states that are unified into one single nation, comes after independence. So between 1947, when there was independence, to 1950, then each state, there is a negotiation between, India and the British India and the princely states to consolidate it into one political unit, and that in which they were part of the independence negotiations with Britain, as a condition of freedom. Pakistan, of course, becomes completely hived off again. The two unfinished business of the integration is, of course, Kashmir, because Kashmir was also part of the princely state, which was supposed to be integrated, but did not happen. And that dispute continues. And Balochistan in Pakistan, which is again a disputed kind of thing. So these protectorates, they had a different kind of administrative structure. They had what was called, they had independent rulers, but as far as foreign policy is concerned and military policy, defense policy is concerned, they were completely under British control. But the system that was there, and I'll come to why this understanding the protectorates is important in South Asia. The system that operated was that the British said that they were protecting these people, these rulers, and they were required to raise the army for Britain, supposedly for their own protection, and also pay them money. So the money for the British army came from, the British Indian army came from the Indian rulers, and the soldiers also came from the Indian rulers. So it was with the Indian money, or the South Asian money, I should say, because India was not India in the way we talk about it today. The South Asian money and South Asian men who were the backbone and the pillars of British colonialism. And I think that is an important thing, because we'll come to how that role continues. Afghanistan, Nepal, and Bhutan were not were most free of all the other compared to other princely states, but they still did not have their own foreign policy. They could not have their own foreign policy. And Sri Lanka and Maldives were not part of what is called the British Indian Empire, but they were part of the British Empire. So that was the thing. And the reason why that is important is that the British Indian Empire was a creation of British colonialism, and it was like an empire within an empire. So the whole idea of India's nation state that you have today, the whole construct comes as an empire within an empire. Yeah. And that is how it is built. And why it was built like that? Because South Asia was the geographical base for the expansion of British Empire. So it was from South Asia, South Asian money, South Asian men, that British Empire expanded to Middle East, to East Africa. It fought the Boer Wars, Southeast Asia, North Africa, Sudan, Egypt, Aden, Iran. The whole expansion, Iraq, India was the base. And that is how that expansion took place. India was a supplier of soldiers. Yeah. 1914, for example, the British Indian Army had 240,000 men. And the British Army, that is the UK Army, had 247,000 men. So which was almost similar, equal. Yeah. In 1918, during the World Wars, the Indian Army was considered Imperial Strategic Reserve. And 1.3 million men fought in that war. 1 million were deployed overseas around the world. And 75,000 died in the war. And in the princely states, they were required to form units, the Imperial Service Brigades, frontier militia, military police, etc. They supplied 1 million men. And likewise with Nepal, Sri Lanka, they've all, been part of that. And South Asia was also the production base. That is where all the equipment, your uniforms, all those kind of things were made. And of course, as I've said, South Asia also financed the war, both in the directly ruled states as well as indirectly ruled states. But the world wars was also resulted in the unraveling of the British Empire. What World War I did was, at the end of World War I, there was a spate of anti-colonial struggles across South Asia. Largely because these soldiers, who were largely from the peasantry, going and fighting all these wars in Iraq and Iran and all kinds of other places around the world, they came, and they used to be treated like second-class citizens. And they came back saying, why are we fighting Britain's wars? And that was an important push for anti-colonial movements. The first independent government of India was formed in exile in Kabul. And that came out of, just before the World Wars. Now, First World War began. And of course, during the Second World War, Japan came very close to Calcutta. Calcutta, they thought, was going to fall. And the losses in Burma was also largely because of the treatment of Indian soldiers. They never got the uniforms that the British soldiers got. They didn't get the equipment that the British soldiers got. And therefore, they had to really fight and died in large numbers. And when Rangoon fell to Japan, there were large prisoners of war who were captured. And then there were Indian nationalists who organized them to fight against British. So, there was all those tensions. And Churchill launched his scorched earth policy in the Northeast, where, he basically cut off food supplies to the entire region, and 6 million people died there. So this was quite a big aspect of the wars there. And that is why I think it was unraveling of the British Empire, as I said, because without the South Asian army, there was no British Empire. That needs to be clear about that. And that is where also there is a move to then for the British Empire to pass the baton to the American Empire. And that starts with the Atlantic Charter in 1941, where the naval chiefs of US and UK meet at a naval ship in the Atlantic, and they sign an agreement that the post-war arrangements would be made, let's say, peaceful transition from the British to the American Empire. And the Lend-Lease agreements were a big part of it, because then America starts financing Britain's wars and then uses the Lend-Lease agreements to make various negotiations and things. And so, and after World War I, US pressured UK for access to South Asia, or British India as it was called then. Today we would call it South Asia. So there is all those things. And so US then decides to move into South Asia. US had no presence, not even a toehold in South Asia. But because of the way South Asian theater of war was going, then the US decides to be much more decisive, mainly to rein in Churchill, because those 6 million people dying, Churchill thought if India fell to the Axis powers, that would be the end of it. It was game over kind of thing. So what Churchill does is 350,000 US troops land in northeastern India today. And the Lend-Lease agreements, which was used to supply food to the UK, the US unilaterally diverts that to Eastern India because of the large deaths there and the fear that the population would side with the Japanese. So that was the situation there. And then the Second World War, as it comes to a close, leads to a spate of mutinies across the continent, South Asia. The last of which was the Indian Naval Mutiny of 1946, being one of the biggest and clinched the whole issue. And Clement Attlee, the British Prime Minister after the Second World War, basically said in Parliament that Britain is unable to govern, therefore it has no choice but to give independence. So that is the context under which the independence comes about. And Lord Mountbatten remained Governor General of the new states of India, Pakistan, and Burma to oversee the establishment of the new states and their constitutions as it is today. And what these constitutional negotiations meant was negotiating with different groups, the power relationships, who gets how much power, what the Hindus, and the Hindu-Muslim thing between India and Pakistan was one of those unresolved things which Britain could not handle, and therefore came in, led to partition, etc. And in each of these negotiations, the key factor was protection of British imperial interests. So give, independence, but make sure that British imperial interests remained. In some ways, this was not very different from the protectorates, because the protectorates also, it was the same thing. There was war, there were all that. They couldn't completely defeat it for whatever reasons at that time. And so the agreement was made that you can rule your country, but on defense and foreign policy and communications, you will be under the British, protection or tutelage, if you like. After our Second World War, Britain becomes effectively a subsidiary power of the US. This is because of the Lend-Lease agreements, because Britain is severely indebted to the US after the Second World War. It becomes the largest recipient of Marshall Plan money. And the British military establishment and the US military establishments have become much more closely integrated, partly during the war, but after the war also. And the UK becomes the front state for Europe. It should be UK there. The UK becomes effectively the front state in Europe and NATO. So, for the US. And South Asia, generally, it is an understood thing, remains British responsibility, but under overall US geopolitics. So this is how the South Asian, modern South Asia has emerged and the states have emerged. So now with this history, I want to fast forward to pivot to Asia, because we can't really talk about South Asian militarism without talking about pivot to Asia. Now, as a background to pivot to Asia, one is the decline of US as an economic power. After 1945, there is a steady decline. In the late 60s, there is the first crisis and the OPEC oil crisis. In the 1980s, there is a banking crisis and US experiments with Reaganism and neoliberalism and all that. 1990s, there is another crisis. It tries to neoliberalize the international order. You have the structural adjustments. You have, all those things. And then after 2008, there is another crisis, a far more deeper crisis. And by 2008, there is a feeling that the American post-war model is not working. There is universal skepticism, not even within the US and outside the US, that somehow that model is not working. And the feeling that during this time, China has been making steady inroads into other areas. And that is the time Obama was elected. If you remember, Obama was elected during the last stages at the height of the 2008 financial crisis. In the meantime, in the US, what has been happening is after 1945, the US becomes more and more militarized as a state and the political economy. I mean, that is why Eisenhower called it the military-industrial complex way back in the 60s. And one of the things that the Cold War did was, in the name of containing the Soviet Union, the US became very militarized. And as Cato Institute is a very right-wing, conservative institute, and they say the conflict, that is the Cold War, helped complete the transformation of the United States from a federalist into a centralized Bismarckian nation state. And after the Cold War, the Pentagon therefore tried to scale that down and tried to adopt what it calls a two-war policy. That means if we have a war in two fronts, then somehow we could manage, and that was the thinking at that time. But then with 9/11, and there was continued military engagement in the Middle East, and no wars were really ending. So you can't just start a war and say close it because we want two wars at a time and not more. And so it becomes that whole cycle doesn't go. So in the meantime, there is a feeling that US is getting caught in these wars and becoming heavily indebted, militarized, all that. In the meantime, China was taking over the economic front and making economic inroads. So that was the main fear. That is why Obama in 2009 announces this policy of pivot to Asia. And what is the pivot to Asia? The two key words in that policy is reorienting and rebalancing. So we reorient our approach and we rebalance. And the main aim of pivot to Asia was to halt the economic advance of China. And that's the important thing. And then the second aim which is important for South Asia, is get the South Asian countries to pay for US security in men and materials. So that is the two key policies: halt China's economic advance, and then halt it through military means, because economically US is not in a position to face China economically. So use it militarily. But because we don't have money, how can we get the South Asians to pay for it? The pivot to Asia policy was elevated. I'm just fast forwarding a bit here. Was elevated to a framework document, which is a much more binding document. It's more than a policy, and it takes on a more legal kind of framework there. So under Trump, it is elevated to a framework document. And so this important thing to note here is, from Obama to Trump, there is no effective policy change as far as basic military security policies are concerned. So the Pivot to Asia program, the elevated framework, what framework documents do is they create a framework within which then there can be many other agreements, many other aspects covered in that. So that's kind of the framework within which there are, with other countries, with other sectors, there are other agreements that can be negotiated. So the framework agreement says a strong India in cooperation with like-minded countries would act as a counterbalance to China. This is identified as main US interest in the region. India remains preeminent in South Asia and takes the leading role in maintaining Indian Ocean security, increases engagement with South Asia, and expands economic, defense, and diplomatic cooperation with other US allies and parties in that region. That is identified as the desired outcome of the strategic framework. So India will now engage with all the other Southeast Asian countries, and will take a really leading role in maintaining security in the Indian Ocean, etc. That would be the ideal outcome according to the framework. The United States and its partners on every continent are resistant to China and its activities aimed at undermining their sovereignty, including through covert and coercive influence. This is again identified as a desired outcome, that the partners in every country become resistant to China. That should be the identified, a desired outcome. Build regional support for US-India common principles in the Indian Ocean. And that is again something that is identified. So we will build the US-India common principles in the Indian Ocean. So we will promote India to do this work in the Indian Ocean region and make sure that everybody else comes on board. Strengthen the capacity of emerging partners in South Asia, including Myanmar, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, to contribute to a free and open order. So those are the action points in the strategic framework agreement. So if you look at the text of the document, it's quite explicit what is going on. And much of this can be related to what the states in the region are doing and how they are how the politics in the region is playing out. Now, the strategy to counter China in South Asia, the objective is to promote US values throughout the region to maintain influence and counterbalance Chinese models of government. So the political model is, you counter that model. And this is particularly important at a time when time after time in every crisis, the US model is seen to be failing. So how do you do that? And they say by developing public and private messaging, support activists and reformers throughout the region. The other objective is enhance US engagement in the region while also educating governments, businesses, universities, Chinese overseas students, media, general citizenry about China's coercive behavior and influence operations around the globe. What are the action points? Establish a mechanism that provides publicly available information, explains China's activities and the problems they pose to interests. Liberty, sovereignty of nations, invest in capabilities that promote uncensored communication between Chinese people. The reason I've put this up as from the strategy document is because wars nowadays are never only about, fighter jets and aircrafts and military weaponry and things. So you can see here, this is a war military strategy document where propaganda, where, friendly governments, businesses, universities, everything is included in this. And that explains the extraordinary levels of, information, propaganda messaging that has been coming through, which is making it very difficult to even have a conversation, a sensible conversation about what is happening in the region now. Now, as a result of this framework agreement, there has been a series of foundational agreements with India. So after the end of the Cold War and the neoliberalism, for the first time in the 1990s, there were joint naval exercises in the Indian Ocean with Australia, which was a big break for India from its, previous role. In 1995, there was the formation of the Indian Ocean Rim States. Then there was the 2000 strategic partnership, beginning with Bill Clinton's visit to India, general security of military information. That this is a whole series of strategic partnership agreement, joint India's nuclear cooperation, etc. If you want a litmus test for understanding the South Asian policy, ask yourself this question: how much, with Iran is a signatory to the Atomic Energy Treaty. And in spite of that, look at the way the powers have gone, Western powers, US and allies have gone after Iran for the nuclear, for so-called producing nuclear weapons. Whereas India and Pakistan are not even signatories to the Atomic Energy Convention. And in spite of that, and they have their nuclear weapons, it's clearly weaponry, but it's all got pardoned, if you like, because of the whole way in which India and Pakistan both feature in the Pivot to Asia and the framework agreements. For example, the joint framework agreement for India-US civilian nuclear cooperation exempts India specifically from the International Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And of course, then it comes together with the Henry Hyde India Peaceful Atomic Energy Cooperation Act, which commits India to align her foreign policy to the US. Yeah. And India's membership to global non-proliferation regimes, etc., is granted. India gets membership into all these nuclear clubs, even though it is not a signatory to the Atomic Energy Convention. So that shows you how much it is part of the Pivot to Asia and the Indo-Pacific agreements. So some of the other foundational agreements I've just listed there. It goes from major, it was in 2018, it was 16, it was designated as the major defense partner. In 2018, it was elevated to strategic trade authorization tier 1 status, which allows India to receive license-free access to wide range of military and dual-use technologies that are regulated by the Department of Commerce. So anyway, and then of course there is the quadrilateral security dialogue where Mike Pompeo said he proposed the purpose of the group was to protect our people and partners from the Chinese Communist Party's exploitation, corruption, and coercion. And now, of course, you have AUKUS, which is, I won't go into that, this is a bit more. So you can see that how the framework agreement has led to a whole series of sub-agreements under that. Interestingly, with the pivot to Asia, the UK also, India adopts a look east policy. So you can see how it fits into this overall. Then there is all this rhetoric and the thing about, oh, we are going to look east, and people think, therefore, he's not looking west. But the looking east policy is driven by the West policy. It is not an anti-West policy. It is driven by that. And then, interestingly, UK also adopts a look east policy after the framework agreement. Yeah. And Jeremy Hunt, the foreign secretary, said in an op-ed piece, why I'm looking east for my vision of it was his vision of post-Brexit prosperity. And William Gavinson, I don't want to go into Brexit, but it's interesting that they see this whole looking east as post-Brexit policy. And if you see what I said earlier about Britain's alignment to US, it all starts to make sense why Britain would also want to look east and India would also want to look east. India, UK signed an enhanced military security cooperation agreement. Then what happens? India starts to engage with Myanmar. So you have UK imposing sanctions on Myanmar for supposedly military rule and suppression of democracy and all that. But India goes and signs a memorandum of agreement on defense. Yeah. So Sri Lanka, and Jude has talked about Sri Lanka, so I won't go into it. But in Bangladesh, again, there is an MOU with India and Bangladesh on defense framework agreement. Yeah. And UK and Bangladesh, again, have strategic dialogue. There have been 4 strategic dialogues on modernization of Air Force, etc. And Afghanistan, India was under pressure to do more in Afghanistan, but, and Obama started, it was part of the Pivot to Asia program that he started withdrawal from Afghanistan as a key policy, because there was the feeling that they were getting too bogged down in the Middle East and they won't be able to tackle China if they just remain kind of stuck in the Middle East. So Obama starts the withdrawal from Afghanistan policy, which of course was later completed by Biden. And Pakistan, which the partition gave the US a foothold in South Asia on the Western side, because US was the first to recognize and support Pakistan. Straight away after recognition, it created the Seato-CENTO agreements, and Pakistan became involved, part of the US's Middle Eastern policy. Although Pakistan's natural, historical, cultural home is South Asia, but the US after 1947 takes Pakistan into its Middle Eastern strategy against Iraq and so on, and aligned Pakistan to US Middle East and anti-Soviet policies, from which Pakistan has a whole raft of its own internal problems. So from this, what can we say about militarism in South Asia? One is the continuity of colonial relationships that is visible in all interstate alliances. You can see it's the same. The British Indian Empire was created for this. And now India is again taking on that same role that it was playing in the British Empire. But the most important thing here to remember is that federal India, when we say India, we talk about the federal government, is not the real India. India has got 29 nations at least, and other regional things. So I think one of the things that the point to take away from that history and the continuity of the international role that India is playing today is also that nation states as a framework for understanding militarism in South Asia has only limited value. Because when you look at the international relations, it is very much, there is a continuity with the old British Empire. Now, China's economic expansion is countered with US militarism. What does that do? All the countries need some financial support because they have adopted a development model that was very much based on, modernization, investments, corporations coming in, etc. So if US is not able to provide that, and if Britain is not able to provide that, these countries, including India, are increasingly turning to China for, updating their ports, for building their railroads, for, all those kind of things. And because the US is not able to meet it on economic terms, then you have a militarism driving that. What that does is, in every country, it creates an extraordinary tension. As this conflict increases, it is going to divide every single country in South Asia. Because what do? Already it is happening. Anything you say, oh, the Chinese are doing terrible things, the Chinese are doing that, nobody sees the Americans because they are not seen. It happens at interstate level. What agreements a government sign with, US and policies and things. That also means that the states become weakened internally. And therefore, there are internal pressures. How does that play out? Because South Asia is one of the most, historically, this is not something that has come with modernization. Historically, because of its geographical, historical position, South Asia has been a crisscross of different identities, races, religions, everything. And I would think it would be fair to say that for South Asians, it will be impossible to reduce themselves to any single identity. So I can say I am Tamil, but then, it's not enough. Tamils can be Hindu, Muslim, Christians. Tamils can be, upper caste, lower caste. So it makes, and this is across the region. You can be a Punjabi and be a Hindu Punjabi, Muslim Punjabi, Christian Punjabi. You can be a Muslim who speaks, 20 different languages, depending on where you are. So this is the history of the region, which means that the alliances that the British built with particular groups and people, and they still have those connections, they have structured the state in certain ways. And I think Jude spoke about it very well in relation to Sri Lanka and the Tamil issues. But you will have similar kind of problems with Baluchis, for example, same problem, the Karens, the Pashtos, Tamils, Chittagong tracts, Kashmir, Northeast, those kind of things are all kind of there simmering. And when these tensions come, militarization in this form, the pivot to Asia comes to Asia, all these things will play out in terrible ways. And I think that is the important thing to realize, that if people don't realize what is driving this, then there's going to be a lot of other social upheavals. But at the same time, the states become more and more and more authoritarian, as you can see in India, what is happening now, because they are not able to govern. They're dependent completely on this. Now, only with military might, that's the only support they are getting. Look at the expenditure on arms that India has spent. If a fraction of that was spent on, Dalits or Adivasis or forest people or whatever, that would be a different social situation, but they're not able to do that. And that is why governing in any democratic way is becoming extremely difficult. So what do? You beat down the Kashmiris, you beat down the... But it also has a military dimension. For example, Article 370 in Kashmir, it borders, what did they do? They divided the state into three. So Leh and Ladakh, which is actually, within meters of the Chinese border, is now completely under central control. Just last week, the Border Security Forces jurisdiction, which was 15 kilometers along the border, is now extended to 50 kilometers along the border, which means large parts of Punjab, Kashmir, all come directly, Rajasthan, Gujarat, come directly under army rule. So so this kind of militarization is going to is driven by external forces. There is confusion about what is driving it, and China is seen as the enemy, partly because of propaganda, partly because it's Chinese businesses that are actually taking people's land and people's whatever. And therefore, the rhetoric has popular appeal, and South Asian people are drawn into this war even without realizing it. And I think that is one of the big challenges we have. So what are the challenges for people, for peace movements? It's important to recognize that Pentagon, at least, sees war as an ecosystem. It's no longer about just militarization. They see the whole war as, so it is economic sanctions, for example, it is political, it is ideological, it is technological, everything. And so combating the propaganda and addressing, the ethnic conflicts within these Asian states and South Asian states and the drivers behind it is a central problem, because if Pentagon is seeing it as an ecosystem, we also need to understand that ecosystem and try to find ways. It's a completely different kind of challenge. And I would say that, a lot of people's understanding about what is or is not war is also the, sorry, I've lost it there. Yeah, so, I mean, since World War II, at least, and the invention of aerial warfare, all wars are wars against people. There is it's not like land wars where you could say, oh, you don't, attack the women and children, you only men fight one to one. That kind of warfare has gone. And therefore, the more technological this war gets, I mean, aerial warfare by definition is warfare. You can't just distinguish between civilians and things. So much of the rhetoric that goes with this wars, we have to fight China, and China's doing terrible things and America is doing that kind of thing. I think there has to be much more realization that, at least since the invention of aerial warfare, war is no longer something that you can legally or, differentiate between good wars, just wars, unjust wars, etc. So, challenges for South Asia: anticipating what is coming, because that is something we don't really do. Organizing, because peace movements don't just happen. Resistance to war just not does happen. Somebody has to put energy, resources, men, material, all those things, and resistance. And if we don't anticipate it, I think we can find ourselves in very difficult situations in each one of our country. And that is why I wanted to kind of see South Asia as a region and not just do India or not just do Pakistan or one country or the other country, but see it as a region, because the region, and the thing about South Asia is that it's a region which is historically and culturally, it's a very common, it's a common civilization in a broad sense and that way. But it is the modern state structure that has come, and the establishment of the army and armed forces and the ethnic composition of the armed forces, which is all a colonial construct. And it is trying to see how we can transcend that and draw on the cultural and historical commonalities in the region, which is our strength, I think. So that is, I'll just leave it there.